Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of the Optimized Muslim podcast. In this podcast, I wanted to do something a bit different because those of you who follow me on YouTube, and we're getting close to 200 subscribers now, alhamdulillah, I uploaded a video about a week ago and it was in Urdu and Punjabi. So what I wanted to do was obviously upload that video as a podcast, but at the same time, I'm aware that not everyone that follows me even understands Urdu or Punjabi, so I just wanted to add to it, as well as providing somewhat of a general translation, but also providing more examples and context as to the point that I was making. And before I get into that, I just wanted to give you an update as to the project in general. I have been updating the website and it's still a work in progress, but I've been updating the resources, or what I call the mental diet page, where I'm listing all of the courses, books, personalities that I follow, etc., that I've benefited from and I think can benefit other Muslims as well in relation to self-development and psychology and Islam, and I think that might be a beneficial resource for you to check out. Essentially, the main point of this Urdu and Punjabi video that I'm referring to, which I will add the audio at the end of this kind of English segment of this podcast, so you can listen to that if you're interested. The main point behind it was that the small things matter in relation to Islam and how we should carry ourselves. And I only provided one example because I felt as though the point's quite clear cut as it is. Not too many examples are required because the inherent nature of practicing the deen and the different obligations that we have to practice, and you can tell just by looking at that and how they're stipulated in terms of the numbers and the specificity and the routine and whatnot, that it lends itself to what you can call, in a way, a conscientious kind of personality, or you have to have a conscientious approach when it comes to practicing the deen. And my point was that culturally, and the studies kind of prove this, some cultures are more event-based, other cultures are more time-based, and then different cultures put a different amount of emphasis on the smaller things, whether it's time or whether it's just the little things here and there, and that has a trickle down or a rollover effect on people's practice of the deen. And then if you magnify that, or you spread it across a large enough group of people, obviously that's going to translate into a massive cultural difference in how the deen is being practiced in different countries and different places around the world. So the example I gave at the start of that video was about how oftentimes me being a British Pakistani, we might joke about how in Pakistan, or Pakistani people, they don't really abide by time as much as what's the norm in the UK or in the Western kind of culture. And that's often turned into jokes about how if you're invited to a wedding, if it says 7 o'clock, you turn up at 9:30 and they probably haven't started yet. Those kind of jokes. But obviously, normally it's a surface level kind of joke, passing comment, if you like. But then if you delve into it, my point was that can translate into more pronounced effects even when it comes to the deen, which is supposed to be the most important thing for us Muslims. And the example I cited was a story that I heard in relation to Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an, and it's a story in which he was conducting a meeting with one of his governors, which he had called from another part of the Islamic Empire at that time, and they were discussing issues in relation to governance. So the meeting was ongoing, and then the governor changed the topic or engaged in some small talk or asked about something not concerning the official talking points, let's say. And at that time, Umar ibn Khattab, he switched the light off, the candle that was lighting up the room that they were in. So obviously they were sat there in darkness, and the other governor, he basically was a bit shocked, like, what's going on? And Umar ibn Khattab was explaining that obviously whilst they were talking about official matters, he left the light on. But as the light's being funded by the Baytul Mal, the wealth of the empire or the Muslims, then he doesn't feel it's right that the light should remain on when they're talking about unrelated, non-official matters. Now, it's a very impactful story, or at least it was for me when I first heard it, and I was trying to create a juxtaposition between that and what we can find in different cultures around the world, how the small things are deemed to be irrelevant or they don't really matter. And I was explaining how starting off small, what matters to whom depends on the context and depends on their means. Something small, something what we may perceive as being a small thing may not be such a small issue for someone else, and vice versa. So if we have this ingrained mentality on a psychological level, that's why we often see misuses of kind of power and injustice and whatnot, or it's one of the reasons. Because oftentimes, let me give you an example. If someone's a low earning employee somewhere, or he's a cleaner, and for him disregarding a small thing might be, as part of his job, he's supposed to clean a section of a hall, and disregarding his duties, he just thinks, it doesn't matter, and he leaves off one of the corners. For him, in his kind of working space or in his kind of work life, that's like cutting the corners or not going by the book completely. But the impact of that is, okay, it's just a corner of the halls not going to be spotlessly clean. It might not really mean much to him or his employer or whatever else. But then if his employer did that, who's maybe got control over the hotel or many hotels, for him a small thing isn't going to be not cleaning a corner of the hotel. For him a small thing might be misdeclaring certain revenue or tax or anything else, or cheating people out of contracts. And according to his context, that might be a small thing. But then again, if you go levels above that, if you go to a billionaire, or if you go on the government level, what's seen as a small thing is, again, it's going to rise in proportion to their status or in proportion to their context. So although the example that I gave about, switching off a light and, it's just a small thing, or not being punctual, or having this mindset where you think they're not important, it seems like a small example, but what I was pointing to is the mindset that it can potentially engender. So the conclusion in a way is, obviously we're trying to change culture in a positive way, shifting culture towards the Islamic ideal, right, amongst Muslims, and then obviously that can have a wider trickle down effect, or it can spread outwards. So obviously in terms of your Dini life, I always say the tagline, optimizing the Muslim's mindset for meaningful success in this life and in the hereafter. Obviously having that kind of way of thinking is only beneficial to you in terms of the deen, and I'll explain that in a few moments. But in terms of the worldly life, it's also beneficial because you can develop an identity as being someone who doesn't cut corners. And I don't mean cut corners from the work hard perspective or the hustle perspective, right? I mean cut corners from the things, how you are when no one's watching. And then over time, say if that's in the context of an employer or employee or family members or friends or whatever, over time you develop this identity or reputation as being someone who is completely fair. He won't cheat anyone, he'll do things as they're supposed to be done. If that multiplies, that's how culture changes. It starts on the individual level, right? And now turning to the religious side of things. Okay, I'm interested in psychology, and I don't really go into it that much here, but if you think about it, you can argue, or one can argue, that the deen, how it's structured in terms of practicing the different obligations, praying 5 times a day, 2.5% zakat, you pray this many times, you break your fast at this time, it's a specific moment here, and this is how you calculate zakat. And the more you learn about anything, whether it's the marital rules or anything else, inheritance, you realize how specific the rules are and how much discussion there's been about that amongst the scholars. So you can argue that the deen lends itself towards someone who's conscientious, right? Because who is a conscientious person in terms of the big 5 personality traits that are often mentioned? Conscientious person is someone who, I haven't got the official definition in front of me, but it's someone who follows rules. He likes a structure, he or she likes a structure in terms of doing things, and they generally abiding to authority. They like order, and they're generally the kind of people that will work according to a plan, right? So you can argue that the way we have to do certain obligations in the deen, someone who's naturally conscientious, and they say that depending on the trait, personality is 30 to 80% genetically heritable, right? So depending on the trait, someone could have a massive advantage, because if they're naturally born like that and they've always had those tendencies, all they have to do is apply that to the deen, or they won't even have to, it'll naturally happen. And it might be easier for them to stick with it than someone who's naturally the opposite, because for them, following a structure and a plan is more alien, so it's going to be more difficult for them. But then here's the thing, that's the test, right? No one can argue against that. No one can argue, oh, I think really the specifics aren't that important. And I think people do, but we never really delve into it. I would argue, or at least put out there and give you something to think about, because who am I? I'm just someone who's putting out these ideas that I found beneficial. I would argue that a lot of times, or there's a divide that's often highlighted between those who are super by the book practicing, and then people say, oh, they haven't got good character, but they're praying all their salah and they're doing this and they're really strict in their practice, but they haven't got the good character. And then on the other side, you've got what I like to refer to as the uber kind of, not liberal, but artistic kind of airy-fairy, Islam is in the heart tendencies. They might even do the obligations, right? And if they do, that's great. But they'll have these tendencies. And again, that can often go back to their personality traits in terms of openness, in terms of conscientiousness. So oftentimes where people's views are coming from, if you delve into it from a psychological perspective, I think that gives us another perspective from which we can understand that and have empathy towards each other. Now, just in conclusion, to give some practical advice, and I want to take this project more towards the how-tos. Like I always say, it's not about the knowledge, it's not about the information. We've got more access to information than ever before, right? We've got all the hadith books at our fingertips, we've got all the translations, we've got what this scholar has said and everything. It's more about application. Knowing is not enough. So what I would kind of conclude on the basis of what I've said is that we can develop this, and if we couldn't, it wouldn't be in the deen. It's as simple as that, because as much as you can get very nuanced about it, I was having a conversation in the last podcast and podcast as well with Brother Martin from Netherlands, muslimfit.com, and we were talking about how certain genetic predispositions in terms of these factors like personality and whatnot, that can affect what people can do. So as much as we like to motivate people and try to encourage people to develop themselves, we were kind of having a bit of a nuanced conversation about how much it is in their control in a way, right? But then at the same time, the dichotomy, if you like, is that Islam's all about that. Islam's all about striving and making improvements, and muhasabah and muraqabah, which muhasabah is like taking account of yourself, and obviously there's that famous quote of take account of yourselves before you're accounted for, in a way. And then there's muraqabah, which is like watching over yourself, or like keeping an eye on what you do and reflecting over what you do. So it's within the ethos of Islam to develop that. Now, the difference is how to maintain empathy along with that. Along with emphasizing that, we also maintain empathy because everyone's on a different level. And the way to do that is, one, each act of obedience is a blessing. So we be grateful. It saves us from having an ego. It saves us from seeing ourselves as better. But on the other hand, if you understand, we're not results orientated necessarily. It's more about effort, and the ultimate judge is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's nothing to worry about. There's no point looking at other people and what they're doing, because it seems quite an obvious thing, but sometimes we don't think about it like this. Everyone's going through their own journey. And I don't mean to say that in that way that I hate when I hear people say, oh, don't judge me. I'm not saying it in that context. I'm saying it in the context of, let's take two people, person Alif and person Ba. Person Alif, he's the son of one of the Imam of the Haramain, right? As an example. And he's been brought up in that environment. He started going to the classes when he was 2 or 3. He memorized the Quran when he was 7. He's always been practicing praying in the masjid. He's had access to the best scholars, and his personality, mashallah, was inclined towards practicing the deen, and he was blessed in that way. And when he's 25, he's an upcoming mufti in a university in Saudi Arabia, and he's praying all the salah in the Masjid al-Haram and getting 100,000 times the reward for each salah. That's person alif. Person ba, you've got someone in an inner city in the UK street who was perhaps neglected as a youth, broken family, and he connected back to the deen in his teens, and he went on this side, and then he got a bit extreme, and he was learning more, and as he learned more, he's kind of fought his way, and he's at a completely different path. Now, how they're going to be, apparently you can look at their situation and think, you got perfect Muslim Superman alif on one side, and you've got the struggling Muslim on the other hand. But that's a very kind of shallow way of looking at it, because you don't know the judgment, because the judgment is going to be somewhat linked to people's effort and the struggle that they've been through and how much they've strived. So that's something to keep in mind. And in terms of concluding this episode, obviously the practical thing to do is let's try to identify within ourselves those areas, perhaps in deen or anywhere, that we've maybe had the attitude in a way of the small things don't matter that much, right? Try to identify that and try to improve. And then once you develop an identity of being someone that is someone who doesn't cut corners, or someone who does everything right the way it's supposed to be done, and someone who can self-develop and improve and learn new information and constantly improve, it becomes part of who you are. And we know from the kind of psychological literature that identity is a big shifter in terms of behavioral change, right? Even in terms of the language that you use. I think there's a study where there's two groups of people, and if they refer to themselves, for example, in smoking, there's one group that refer to themselves, when they discuss smoking, they say, I don't smoke, right? Or I don't smoke, or I'm trying not to smoke. And those people are much more likely to relapse than the other group, who once they've quit, they basically have an identity shift and they say, I'm not a smoker, because there's more resistance there. Once something becomes part of your identity, it can lend itself towards your kind of the goal that you're going for. So if we see ourselves as Muslims of that kind, it'll lend over time, the people around you embrace that, and it's kind of like self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. And Jazakumullah khairan for listening. And I'm just going to add the Urdu video audio to this if you want to listen to that. If you don't, that's fine. And I'm uploading more content, so keep an eye out on the YouTube channel and other platforms. Any feedback's always appreciated. Assalamu alaikum.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, आप सब कैसे हैं? उम्मीद है कि आप सब ठीक होंगे और खुश मिजाज से होंगे। तो पहले बताता जाऊं कि ये जो प्रोजेक्ट है इसका मकसद क्या है और ये किस नीयत की बुनियाद पर मैंने इसको शुरू किया था। वो ये है कि हमें अपनी सोच को ऐसा बदलना चाहिए, या हमें ऐसी सोच रखनी चाहिए, ऐसा माइंडसेट, ऐसी नफ्सियात जो हमें इस्लाम पर अमल कर मदद करे, ठीक है। और ये जो मौजू है इस वीडियो का, वो ये है कि इस्लाम और सकाफ़त या माशरे के दरमियान जो ताल्लुक़ है उसको हमने कैसे देखना है। बात को शुरू करते हैं कि हम मजाक करते हैं ना कि ये जो पाकिस्तान में जो लोग हैं वो वक्त की कदर नहीं करते, ठीक है। और आप इंग्लैंड के लोग देखें तो वो वक्त की बहुत कदर करते हैं। 5 मिनट इधर उधर हो जाए तो उनको फिक्र पड़ जाती है। ये हम सब बातें करते ज़्यादातर एक मजाकी लहजे में, लेकिन इस पर हम ज़्यादा सोचते नहीं हैं, ठीक है। लेकिन बात ये है कि ये जो कुछ सोचें होती हैं ना, वो जैसे ज़माने गुज़रते हैं ना, वो सोचें उस माशरे का हिस्सा बन जाती हैं, ठीक है। और ये तो एक छोटी मिसाल है, लेकिन बात बड़ी है। और वो ये है कि अगर आप इसका असर फिर देखें कि ऐसी जो बात है इसका माशरे और समाज पर क्या असर होता है, और ये एक फ़ायदामंद इसका जो नतीजा है या ना फ़ायदामंद है, ये हमें इस्लाम की तरफ ले जाता है। हमें आखिरत में ये जो आदतें हैं या ये जो सोच है, ये हमें आखिरत में निजात दिलाएगा या नहीं। पहली बात तो ये है कि जब हम किसी भी ऐसी सोच का शुमार करें ना, तो फिर हमें सोचना चाहिए कि हमने इसको बदलना कैसे है। या तो आप कह सकते हैं, आपका एक बंद ज़हन हो ना, तो फिर आप कहेंगे कि हम कुछ लोग होते ही ऐसे हैं, कुछ लोग ऐसे नहीं होते, जनाती तौर पर फ़र्क है और ہم نے ایسے ہی زندگی گزارنی ہے. ایک تو یہ سوچ ہے. اگر یہ آپ کی سوچ ہے تو پھر آپ کو کچھ نہیں کہہ سکتا, یہاں آپ کسی سے بھی تجویز سننے کے لیے تیار نہیں ہے, ٹھیک ہے. لیکن اصل میں ہوتا یہ ہے کہ یہ بالکل واضح بات ہے کہ یہ ایسی بات نہیں ہے, یہ صرف ایک معاشرے کی عادت ہے, ٹھیک ہے. تو ایک تو رہی وہ بات. دوسری بات یہ ہے کہ اس کا اسلام کے ساتھ کیا تعلق ہے. آپ کو کیا فرق پڑتا ہے کہ وقت پر پابند ہو یا نہ پابند ہو. جیسے میں نے کہا تھا, میں نے مثال تو چھوٹی دی ہے لیکن اس کا اثر بڑا ہے, کیونکہ یہی جو سوچ ہے نا کہ ہم وقت کا اتنی قدر نہیں کرتے, اس کا پھر اسلام پر اثر آ جاتا ہے. وہ کیسے کہ یہ جو چھوٹی چھوٹی باتیں ہوتے ہیں نا, اس کی کوئی پرواہ نہیں کرتا. لیکن اسلام کے جو فرائض نے آپ دیکھیں, اگر آپ نے اسلام کے فرائض پر عمل کرنا ہے, ان کی بنیاد ہی یہ ہے کہ آپ چھوٹی باتوں پر توجہ دیں. آپ منٹوں کے حساب سے, فیصدوں کے حساب سے, مثلا 2.5% دینا ہے یا 5 منٹ ادھر ادھر نماز کا وقت ہو جائے تو وہ نماز آپ کی قبول ہی نہیں ہوتی. کتنے بھی وضو میں کتنی بار آپ نے کون سے عمل کرنے ہیں, آپ نے نماز کیسی پڑھنی ہے, آپ نے دیار میں یہ جو ذکر کرنا ہے وہ کتنی بار کرنا ہے, سب کچھ ترتیب کے ساتھ. جیسے کہتے ہیں نا, انگلش میں کہیں گے کہ the deen is all about specificity. اس لیے یہ جو سوچ ہے یہ آپ کو اسلام پر عمل کرنے کے لیے آپ کی یہ سوچ مدد نہیں کرے گی. اور اب اس بات کی کوئی تردید تو نہیں کر سکتا کہ نہیں یہ اسلام میں نہیں ہے. یہ تو ہمیں ماننا پڑے گا کہ یہ اسلام میں ہے. یہ اسلام میں ہے کہ آپ کو اس وقت آپ نے روزہ کھولنا ہے, اس وقت آپ نے روزہ بند کرنا ہے. آپ یہ تو نہیں کہہ سکتے کہ چلو اس کا کیا ہے, یہ تو 2-3 منٹ, تو چلو آج میں نے 3 سجدے کا لے تو کیا بات ہے. ایسے تو ہماری سوچ نہیں ہے. تو پھر ایسا ہی ہمیں زندگی میں چلنا چاہیے اس سوچ کی بنیاد پر. اور اب میں پنجابی وچ تھوڑی جی گل کرنا, پنجابی وچ تھوڑی صحیح گل دا اثر ہو جاتا ہے, نالے تھوڑی مزے دی گل ہوندی ہے. ایک میں تسانوں مثال دینا, پہلی بار یہ مثال سنی نا بڑا اثر ہویا, تے امید ہے کہ تساں دے بھی اسی طرح اثر ہوئے گا. وہ یہ عمر ابن خطاب دی حکومت ہی, ٹھیک ہے, تے انہوں نے ایک اپنے وزیر نو بلایا کسی اور علاقے تھی, ٹھیک ہے. جس ویلے انہوں دی بات چیت ہوندی نا پی, وہ پہلا عوام دے بارے وچ جے انہوں دے مسئلے انہوں دے بارے وچ وہ گل پہ کردے, تے انہوں دی گل بات ہوندی رہی. جرا وہ وزیر ہے نا, اس نے کسی اور موضوع پر گل چھیڑ دیتی, تے جوں اس نے گل چھیڑی نا, تے عمر ابن خطاب نے جری بتی بجا چھوڑی, ٹھیک ہے. وزیر ظاہر ہے اس نے کہ امیر المومنین اے کہ ہوئے, تے جواب ملیا بھئی پہلاں تے جڑی اساں دی گل لی وہی عوام دے مسئلے دے بارے وچ, ٹھیک ہے, وہی حکومت دے بارے وچ, بیت المال تی یہ پیسے آمدے جس نال یہ بتی چلدی ہے پی, ٹھیک ہے. جیوں تو مثلا گل ہوں کسی اور موضوع پر گل کیتی ہے نا جس دا اس نال کوئی تعلق نہیں, تو میں پھر بتی بجا چھوڑی ہے, نہیں تو پھر یہ انصاف نہیں, ٹھیک ہے. ہن تسی اس گل دا سوچو تھوڑا جا, اس گل تے نا تسی تھوڑا جا وقت لا کے نا صحیح توجہ کرو, وہی کیسی بات ہے. تسی سوچ سکتے ہو کہ آج کل دے زمانے وچ اس طرح کوئی گل ہو سکتی ہے. بندے آکھیں گے بھی بھلی اس نے گل کیتی ہے, لیکن اے ہے دین. تے اے تے میں صرف ایک مثال دیتی ہے. تسی کتاباں پڑھو, تسی امام غزالی دی پڑھو بگننگ آف گائیڈنس, جس وچ وہ لکھ دین بھی اپنی دیار کیسے شروع کرنی چاہیے ہے, اے کام کس طرح کرنا چاہیے ہے, اتنی بار تسی اے پڑھو, پھر تسی اے پڑھو, پھر فجر دی بعد اے کرو, سب کچھ ترتیب روٹین کے ساتھ, نکی نکی چیز پر پرواہ, کیونکہ نکی نکی چیز نال تساں دی جنت بندی ہے. جے تساں کسی چیز دی پرواہ ہوندی ہے نا, پھر تسی ہر چیز تے توجہ دیندے ہو. اچھا تو پھر ہن تسی حساب لاؤ بھئی اساں دے معاشرے وچ اس طرح کدے ہوندا ہے. اساں دا کیڑا معاشرہ ہے, میں پاکستان دی گل پیا کرنا, وہ یہ بھئی چلو خیر ہے, اے جڑے 3 لفظ نے نا چلو خیر ہے, انہوں نے معاشرے دا بیڑا غرق کر چھڑی ہے. بلا کیوں؟ اتھوں ہی کام شروع ہوندے. انگریزی وچ ایک وہ آدھے نا how you do anything is how you do everything. مطلب بھئی جس سوچ دے مطابق تسی جرا بھی کام کردے ہو نا, وہی سوچ تسانوں پھر ہوراں کاماں وچ تساں اوہی سوچ استعمال کرنی ہے, ٹھیک ہے. اسی آنے چلو خیر ہے, یرا کوئی پولیس نال مسئلہ ہو گیا تے چلو خیر ہے, فلانے رشتہ دار نو اسی فون کر لانگے بھی انہاں دے اگے نہ کہ آخنے چلو خیر ہے. او یرا اساں اے کسٹمز تی دینے تے فلانے نو بلا کے کر دیں گے چلو خیر ہے اساں فلانے نو سکول وچ دینے تے اس نو پتہ کھ بھی نہیں پر اساں دا دل ہے بھی چنگی سکول وچ جائے تے چلو اس تی سفارش کر لینے خیر ہے کردیاں تسی کتنا کرپشن ہے کردیاں لندن وچ تساں کتنے کروڑاں دے ارباں دے حساب تے تساں فلیٹ لینے ہیں گل ہے تی شروع ہوندی ہے چلو ہے یہ گل ایک بڑی ایک سیریس گل ہے ہن تسی ذرا سوچو وہ جڑا وزیر یا عمر ابن خطاب نے آکھیا نا بھی سارا کچھ ایکسپلین کیتا ہے بتی بجھی ہے نیرے وچ بیٹھے تے ہن اس وزیر نے اگوں آکھیا ہن تسی سوچ سکدے ہو بھی وہ وزیر اگوں آکھیا او یارا چلو ہے ڈزنٹ میک سینس تے اسی اسی طرح ہی کرنے ہاں اس بات کا جو خلاصہ ہے نا وہ یہی ہے کہ اسلام میں نا یہ جو چلو خیر ہے والی بات ہے نا یہ جہاں تک اسلام کے فرد نے یا جہاں تک لوگوں کے ساتھ بات چیت لوگوں کے ساتھ کام لوگوں کے حقوق اسلام کے فرائض کا تعلق ہے اور جہاں تک انسانیت کے حقوق اس میں کوئی گنجائش ہی نہیں چلو خیر ہے کے لیے جہاں تک انصاف ہے جہاں تک ہے اس میں کوئی گنجائش ہی نہیں یہ ہمارے لیے آخرت کو جیتنے کے لیے ایک راستہ ہے ٹھیک ہے اگر اس پر آپ نے نہیں توجہ دینی اگر ہر اس میں جو بھی چھوٹا عمل اس پر اگر آپ نے توجہ نہیں دینی اس کی اگر آپ کو کوئی پرواہ نہیں تو پھر ہم کیا کر رہے ہیں اصل میں آخر میں بات اسی پر آتی ہے کہ یہ صرف چند دنوں کی ایک سفاری ہے چند دنوں کے لیے اس پر ہمیں سوچنا چاہیے کیونکہ وہ کہتے ہیں نا 4 دنوں کا میلہ ہے پھر مٹی دی تیری ایک وہ بھی دیارہ آئے گا جس وقت تساں دسنا پوے گا تساں اے کیتا ہے تساں سوچیا بھی اس دی کوئی اہمیت نہیں تساں سوچیا بھی اے نہیں دسو اس ویلے اسی کی آکھاں گے خیر ہے الحمدللہ السلام علیکم